Welcome to this explainer. Look, today we're going on a seriously fascinating journey, and we're going to cut right through all that typical wellness noise you see all over the internet. No fads, no guessing games, none of that. Instead, we're diving into the hard, quantitative physics of how the human body actually ages. We're going to systematically, completely deconstruct those traditional longevity therapies and look at what the math and the actual science truly tell us about staying biologically young. Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever just stopped for a second to think about the sheer volume of what makes up you? Because when we talk about anti-aging, a lot of people naturally think about, treating specific organs or trying to fix a few cells here and there. But let's look at the actual numbers for a second. Does treating aging on a cell-by-cell basis even make mathematical sense? Well, the short answer is no, absolutely not, and here is exactly why. The human body is composed of something like 37 trillion cells. Just wrap your head around the scale of that number. And the crazy thing is, these cells don't even age on the same timeline. Your red blood cells, they live for about 120 days. White blood cells, they turn over in just 7 days. And then your neural cells are literally with you for a lifetime. So trying to simultaneously treat this massive, completely uniquely aging cellular network of 37 trillion individual units, it's just biologically and mathematically impossible. If we actually want to combat systemic aging, we simply cannot do it cell by cell. We absolutely need a systemic vector, like a unified highway that reaches everything all at once. Now, I know a lot of people try to use lifestyle as that systemic fix, right? Specifically through really severe fasting or intense diets. But we need to explore why extreme fasting fails almost everyone in the long run. Right around age 60, we hit this dramatic inflection point where our natural metabolic expenditure just plummets. It drops off a cliff. What this means is that normal, everyday calorie consumption suddenly turns into this surplus, toxic energy that actually drives chronic disease. To mathematically counteract that drop-off through calorie restriction alone, you'd need a permanent reduction of over 30% in your daily intake, or you'd be doing daily fasts exceeding 18 hours. Let's be real here, the sustainable long-term compliance for that kind of restriction is practically zero. So, since we obviously can't tackle 37 trillion cells directly and extreme fasting isn't sustainable, let's zoom in. We're going from the macro body down to the microtissue level to find the right vector, because aging doesn't happen in a vacuum. If we look closely at the tissue, we've got the intracellular space, which is medically untouchable right now, and the interstitial space, which is basically the domain of surgeons. But right there in the middle, running through literally everything, is the intravascular space. This is the only medically viable unified delivery system we have to treat systemic degradation. It's like a fish tank, right? If you want the fish to be healthy, you don't treat the fish individually, you change the water. So how do we actually target this intravascular space? Well, imagine your typical 65-kilogram person. Inside that total body mass, we have about 5 liters of total blood volume. But when we isolate the actual fluid, the plasma itself, it gets even smaller. We are focusing our target down to a highly concentrated, incredibly finite amount.
Exactly 3 liters. I really want to emphasize this hard number because it's absolutely crucial. Out of your entire body mass, the whole systemic environment, the actual biological alchemy of aging, is dictated by just 3 liters of circulating plasma. Think about that for a second. That's literally roughly the size of one large bottle of soda. Modifying this incredibly concentrated 3-liter reservoir is the actual key to systemic biological alchemy. Suddenly treating aging doesn't seem like such an impossible math problem anymore, does it?
Now, you might be wondering, what about stem cells, right? Because they've been marketed everywhere as the ultimate systemic anti-aging miracle. Well, it's time to bust a pretty major myth. We really need to contrast the widely marketed dream, this idea that IV stem cells somehow intelligently home in on damaged tissue and permanently integrate, with the stark, mathematical, and physical reality of what actually happens in your body. Lean into this traffic jam analogy with me for a minute, because fundamentally, this is just a basic geometry problem. The most commonly used stem cells, mesenchymal stem cells, or MSCs, are roughly 45 micrometers in size. Okay, keep that number in mind. When you administer them intravenously, the very first place they go after leaving the right side of the heart is straight into the lungs. And your lung capillaries? They are only 8 micrometers wide. It's literally like trying to push a basketball through a pipe designed for a baseball. They physically cannot fit through. And the data backs up this physical impossibility perfectly. Because of that exact geometry problem, 95% of intravenously administered stem cells become permanently trapped and sequestered in the lung capillaries immediately upon entry, just instantly stuck. After 24 hours, the survival rate of these cells in your blood is a microscopic 0.3%. They're completely cleared out. Direct systemic repair using IV stem cells is physically impossible. What they actually do is offer indirect paracrine signaling, meaning they're just releasing chemical signals from afar before they die, rather than physically integrating into your tissues.
So, if stem cells just get trapped in a traffic jam, what actually works to change our systemic fluid? Let's shift the narrative to the real biological proof we have: heterochronic parabiosis. In the lab, physically fusing the circulatory systems of a young animal and an old animal is literally the only historically proven method to visually reverse aging. But obviously, what about humans? Well, the closest natural benchmark we have to that is late-stage pregnancy. It's a temporary sharing of fluid between a young fetus and the mother, and the data here is mind-blowing. Studies of conservative populations show that a mother whose last pregnancy is at age 45 compared to age 35 increases her probability of reaching age 80 by a massive 50%. It definitively proves that a young fluid environment physically sustains and even rejuvenates an older host.
But wait, before you think the answer is just pumping in young fluid, we have to look at something called the Berkeley revolution. Think of your circulatory system like a car, with a gas pedal and a brake. The huge revelation here is that the toxic load of old blood acts as a dominant brake, and it is clamped down tight. Young fluid, on the other hand, acts like the gas. You cannot simply press the gas by introducing youth factors. It doesn't work. You must first release the brake by extracting and actually diluting those toxic aging factors.
Okay, so what exactly makes the young fluid act like the gas? Back in 2019, this massive study out of Stanford mapped the whole thing out by analyzing thousands of proteins across the entire human lifespan. They effectively created this incredible protein sieve, isolating the exact code of systemic youth. And what they discovered was that out of all those thousands of circulating proteins, only 212 specific plasma proteins decisively decrease with age. Just let that sink in for a second. Out of thousands, just 212 proteins, which are categorized mainly into what they call clusters 5 and 8, are the sole functional drivers of systemic youth. Which brings us to an absolute climax in longevity science, the PX100 protocol. Instead of seeking outside blood, we can actually hack the system using your own biology. It works in this brilliant 4-step sequence. Step 1, they extract just 100 cc of the patient's own blood. Step 2, they separate the autologous cells, meaning, the patient's very own cells, from the plasma. Step 3, they use specific proprietary formulas to stimulate those exact cells to release the vital, high-concentration youth factors we literally just talked about. And finally, Step 4, they engineer and scale this into 900 cc of young autologous plasma and reintroduce it into the body. This dilutes the toxins, taking the foot off the brake, and hits the gas on cellular repair. So, synthesizing everything we've covered today, the blueprint is crystal clear. We systematically looked at the entirety of this research, deconstructing those old longevity myths. We know the impossibility of treating trillions of cells one by one. We've seen the thermodynamic limits of fasting, and we understand the physical geometry failures of IV stem cells. And we've replaced all of that with the direct, quantitative mechanics of microplasma exchange. By targeting the intravascular space, we are quite literally re-engineering systemic aging right at its biological source. Which leaves us with this final, really profound thought to ponder. If we know for a fact that our entire systemic environment relies on just 3 liters of plasma, and if we can now mathematically and biologically engineer those exact 3 liters to dilute toxic aging factors and replenish those specific 212 proteins that dictate our biological clock, then is living healthfully to 120 no longer a distant medical miracle, but simply a solvable equation? I want you to really think about that and honestly question everything you thought you knew about aging. Thanks so much for joining me today on this explainer. I really hope this completely changes how you look at longevity.